Hey trade pros, hope everyone's doing well and ready for yet another YouTube video. In front of me on the screen you may see a chart, and this is the SPY on TradingView. And in today's video what we're going to be talking about is pivot points. We're going to be talking about how to use pivot points, what are pivot points, and how we can use them effectively to both swing trade and day trade, and how we're going to go through these pivot points on TradingView. So if you guys are excited for this video, please hit that subscribe button and that like button, because we are opening up our live room to traders once we hit that 60,000 subscriber mark here on YouTube. So let's get ready for this intro and get this started. So first, let's start off with what are pivot points. Why don't we clean this chart up a little and we will take a look at what we've got going on here. Now that we've got a relatively clean chart here on the 5-minute on the SPY, you can see that there's a bunch of lines on my chart, and these are what we call the pivot points. I've differentiated between the actual pivot point, the R1, R2, R3, S1, S2, S3, by making the pivot point a white color and leaving the rest of them their orange, their natural orange here on TradingView. Now first, we should talk about what are pivot points before we dive too much into this. And a pivot point is a technical indicator that we use to gauge overall market sentiment, and they could be used as support and resistance areas as well. So you can use a pivot point over different time frames, as I'll show you here today. Currently on the screen we've got the daily pivot point, which means that it is calculated based on yesterday's 3 price movements: the closing price from the previous day and the intraday high and low from the previous day. Now you can also have different time frame period pivot points which calculate prior months, prior weeks, prior years, so on and so forth. So you can have a monthly pivot, a weekly pivot, and a daily. When you go into intraday here on TradingView, you'll get these daily pivot points, which are great for day trading. As you can see, the pivot point here on the SPY held relatively well throughout the day. Now, this indicator is mainly used as support and resistance, but more so I like to use it as a sentiment gauge and a target area. So before we dive too much into these pivot points and how we like to use them both on a larger time frame and a smaller time frame, why don't we show you where you can find them here on TradingView. So if I just go to indicators at the top, and I type in just pivot points, and you can see it's pivot points standard. Once you click on that, it'll be added on your screen here, and then you can use the little drop down menu to go through it, find it, and look at its settings, change the settings how you'd like. But in terms of the inputs, I just keep it traditional. Traditional pivot points. And you can show the historical pivot points if you want or not. You can have the number back, whatever it is. I go like 2 to 3 back usually. And this little area right here pivots time frame. So if you go to auto, it will automatically draw it based on whatever time frame you've selected. That means if I'm on a 5-minute, it'll show me daily pivots. If I'm on an hourly, it'll show me weekly pivots. And if I'm on a daily, it'll show me monthly pivots. And then finally, if I'm on a monthly, I think, or a weekly, I might see the yearly pivots. So for example, if I change these to weekly, you can see that they change drastically here, right? So I don't necessarily want to use the weekly pivots if I'm day trading. If I use monthly, you'll see that they just vanish because they're so far away from the current price. So auto will keep it at daily. You'll see that these are the daily pivots. If you don't know which is which, just go to that time frame and try them out. Meaning, if I go to an hourly, you can see the pivots have shifted, right? So if I change those pivot settings and I go daily, you can see they're not daily pivots on the hourly chart, but instead they're the weekly pivots, right? Because that doesn't change from the auto. Now, I typically like to use the monthly pivots, which appear on a day chart. On a day chart, the monthly pivots will appear. So you can see where the monthly pivot started in May based on the prior month's pivot. So here on the SPY, this is the June pivot based on the May price action. The high, low, and close of May creates these different pivot points. But if I'm a day trader, I'm going to stick to the daily pivots that get churned out on a daily basis. And you can see we are holding the pivot as a support area. Now, the key to day trading with these pivots and using these pivots to day trade is that you want to gauge where the price is pre-market and throughout the day before the market even opens, right? So starting off before the market even opens, you'll gauge where price is in comparison to these pivot points. So that means the price opens above the pivot point. That means the sentiment technically starts off on a bullish note. Now, do you buy every single potential dip that you see throughout the day just because you're holding a bullish note? Not really. Sentiment is bullish because you are above the pivot, but you still want to combine other qualifiers, maybe structure, areas of support and resistance to actually find those trades. So typically when you fall into the pivot point, as you've seen here, obviously it's not going to hold to the tick every single time, but when you fall into the pivot point, you can use that as a strong support area to keep that sentiment alive. Right? So if we fell below the pivot point aggressively and actually use it as a resistance, then we could see that sentiment change. Now, when we are above the pivot and use it as support structure here on a daily basis, right? My target would be based on structure where the highs are, but also the R1 area. Now, just like the pivot, the R1 and the S1 areas can be used as support and resistance levels. As you can see right here on Friday, we ran up into the R1 pre-market and pushed above it. So we're well above the R1, let alone the pivot, meaning that sentiment is bullish. Now, when we enter into the R2 area, I'm expecting to see some kind of resistance hold out here and it turn into support once we break through, right? Which is the case. Now, if we find another day here where we're below the pivot, even though we start off on a pretty bullish note, there is still some sentiment that could be a little more bearish. Now, this isn't you're below the pivot, sell it, you're above the pivot, buy it, but instead it gives you a little more sentiment bias coming into the market. So treat them as support resistance areas, treat them as sentiment areas, but also consider the market structure and how that's playing out before you say, okay, well, we're below the pivot, we have to sell every rally. Because if you do that, you're getting beat up on a day like today. Consider what the other levels are doing. So you open below the S2. The S2 area is going to be resistance. The S4 area, if it holds, is going to be support. S3 is going to be support if we break and retest. S1 is going to try to be support if we break and retest, so on and so forth. So when you're day trading, you can look at an asset, a different asset like Facebook. Facebook likes to hold these. When you're day trading, just consider where you are in relation to the pivot. Consider where you are in relation to the R1s, R2s, whatever it may be, and consider how you may act around those areas. So what I mean by that is, yes, we're above the pivot. I want to see the R1 break and hold as support, right? Which happens here. Holds R2 resistance, pushes up, holds the R2 as support for the next leg, right? Today, on the other hand, you had the pivot holding support for the next wave up, right? We open below the pivot on June 3rd, and we use S1 as resistance multiple times over. So just consider that when you are day trading with these assets. Even if you open above R1, you could still use R2 as resistance to look to sell into it. Now, if we go on a daily basis here, on a daily basis, these huge monthly pivots are very strong key support and resistance areas and sentiment areas. In May, we were below the monthly pivot. You guys can see here. We held the S1 relatively well, held the monthly pivot relatively well as resistance, but when we popped up, that's when we opened the upside. So let's reiterate here. Number one, the pivot is a technical analysis indicator that shows us what the sentiment of the general market may be. Above the pivot, it's bullish sentiment. Below the pivot, you are bearish sentiment. Now, number two, you can use each of these levels as support resistance areas, right? And keep in mind that they should also be target areas. If you're going from pivot up towards R1, that should be your first target. And then number four, even if you are below the pivot, that doesn't mean that you have to sell every rally. You still have to use market structure, qualifiers, and use your other pivot point areas like S1s, S2s, and whatnot to confirm those support, resistance, and trend ideas. So with those 4 rules, I urge you guys to go and check out these pivots on TradingView, and you can use them on a daily basis just like we do here at TradePro Academy. So if you guys enjoyed this video, please drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and thank you so much for watching. Remember, a lot of you guys are still not subscribed, so it'd help us a lot if you hit that subscribe button. And we'll see you guys in our next video. Drop a comment down below. What did you think? Do you use pivot points? And what do you want to see on this channel?